Welcome everyone to the Wilmette Institute's webinar. And this is a webinar panel discussion about science, religion, and the Baha'i Faith, a topic that is great interest to many people, many Baha'is, of course. We have actually 4 of them today who will be giving presentations, and Charlotte Wenninger will be convening and chairing the entire panel. So I will turn all of this now over to Charlotte so she can introduce herself and introduce the panelists.
Thank you very much, Rob, and welcome to the attendees. I'm really excited about being able to host this panel. Just a little bit about myself. I became a Baha'i about 40 years ago, and since becoming a Baha'i, I have been absolutely interested in the topics of science and religion. I took the Science, Religion, and the Baha'i Faith course and enjoyed it so much. I responded back to the faculty members and asked if I could I take it again, and they offered to give me a position as a teaching assistant, and I've been doing that lovingly for the last few years. I'd like to introduce to you at this point Andres. Give a little wave. Andres is my co-host for today, and he will be looking at the questions that you provide to us either in the chat or the question and answer, and he will ask those for the panel members. I will introduce each speaker as they come up. They will be asked to do something very, very difficult, and that is to present what they have to say within a 5-minute deadline. So and then afterwards, I'm going to ask them a few questions myself, and then we'll go on to the next speaker. So as they are speaking, please don't hesitate to offer anything comments, anything in the chat, and we will respond to you after the first hour. So our very first speaker, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Robert Saraceno. Robert has been a faculty member of the Wilmette Science, Religion, and the Baha'i Faith course from the beginning. Robert obtained a doctorate in physics from the University of Victoria in the field of general relativity, and then went on to travel the world. He had many pioneer posts and lived in many places around the world. In fact, if you mention you traveled somewhere in the world, Robert most likely lived there too. Today he will speak. You see there the topic on the slide. He will speak today on the topic of physics, cosmology, and the world of the spirit, the unity of reality. Please help me welcome Robert.
So this talk is on physics, cosmology, and the world of the spirit, the unity of reality. Cosmology deals with the nature of the universe, and we can think of physical cosmology, which is really a branch of science. In general, cosmology is a branch of philosophy, and of course, religion is also included in that. This is a picture of what physical cosmology has discovered in the past century or so. We'll come back to this picture. Cosmology in general asks big questions. What has brought the universe into existence? Has it always existed, and will it always exist? Why is the world intelligible? Does the universe have a purpose? Are we accidents of the universe, or were we meant to be here? Do we have a special place in the universe? Some of these questions, science itself will have very great difficulty answering. But Revelation deals with these. And so we want to ask 3 questions. Are there answers and insights to these questions from Revelation? If so, will they serve as a brake on scientific inquiry, or will they stimulate the further development of science? One of the criticisms that has been made of science by some atheists is that religion answers, or one of the criticisms of religion is that religion asks questions which then stop science from developing. And so this is a critical question. Will the answers given by Revelation stimulate the further development of science? And then we ask, how relevant is the concept of the 2 books, that is the book of nature and the book of Revelation? Physics and physical cosmology have made unprecedented discoveries over the past century or so. They have advanced and transformed our understanding of physical reality at the most fundamental level. They have advanced and transformed our knowledge of the origin, structure, and evolution of the cosmos. The revelation of Baha'u'llah has also made tremendous advances. It has transformed our understanding of ourselves, our understanding of the relationships that bind us together. It has transformed our understanding of the course of our history and of our view of the future of our species on this planet. There are 5 features of Baha'i cosmology which I'd like to touch on. One is that creation has always existed. There is one reality. Reality is hierarchical in nature. The higher is a spiritual reality relative to the lower, and man has a threefold nature: the animal, the human, and the divine. And putting this together, we can say that the human is the power, which is the power of the intellect, is a spiritual reality relative to the animal. On the other hand, the divine, which is awakened in man by the spirit of faith, is a spiritual reality relative to the human. There have been one of the remarkable developments that has emerged from physics is this, that it's been discovered, and it wasn't preordained that it would discover this, but this is what has been discovered. All arrows of explanation go back to 2 fundamental theories: particle physics and gravitational theory. Secondly, new properties of matter emerge as matter combines in ever larger and more complex systems. This is called emergence. And Nobel laureate Philip Anderson wrote a famous paper called "More is Different." And properties of complex systems cannot be derived from the equations governing material at a lower level or from the properties exhibited by that material at that lower level. So if we were to discover a theory of everything, that would tell us nothing about these emergent properties. To give an example, fluid viscosity is not a property of a single particle, but of a collection of particles. You cannot derive fluid viscosity from the fundamental equations of physics. And far, far above fluid viscosity as an emergent property is the property of consciousness. This is not a property of a single particle, but of a living system composed ultimately of elementary particles, which all act under the foreknown forces of physics. Abdu'l-Baha writes, and this is a statement which is consonant with modern physics. It also anticipates modern physics. It is therefore evident that originally matter was one, and that one matter appeared in a different form in each element. Then these elements were composed, arranged, and combined in infinite forms. This composition and arrangement arose through the wisdom of God and his ancient might from one natural order. And this is perfectly compatible with advances in modern physics. And as I say, it anticipates modern physics, because Abdu'l-Baha wrote this before these great developments. And I'd like to conclude this brief introduction with this statement about the unity of reality. Abdu'l-Baha writes, "The spiritual world is like unto the phenomenal world. They are the exact counterpoint of each other." And Baha'u'llah writes, "Regard the world as the human body. The human body is composed of cells, organs, tissues, cells, which all work together to give substance, to give life to the body, and each is nourished by the body itself." So I'd like to close with that.
Thanks, Robert. And I know how challenging that was to wrap up both cosmology and physics together with the revelation of Baha'u'llah in a few short minutes. So thank you very much for doing that, Justice. Now we have a little bit of more opportunity for me to ask you some questions about what I heard you say. So you mentioned the 5 features of Baha'i cosmology, and you stated at the very first bullet point was creation has always existed. And so my question is, it has always existed. Will it always exist? And maybe you can expand a little bit on that particular topic.
Okay, well, this is something which modern physics really cannot deal with. There's a conviction on the part of physicists that, well, there had to be something to precede the Big Bang, and there's been a lot of speculation. Some of it scientific, others non-scientific, but by scientists. For instance, we live in a multiverse and so forth. But science really, all we know at the moment is as far as we can go back at the moment is the moment of the Big Bang. That's all that we can say. There are some theories, one particular by Nobel laureate Roger Penrose, which says that the universe will expand to the point at which suddenly everything will just begin again. It won't recollapse, but everything will eventually be all spread out over a long period of time as the universe continues to expand, and then it'll begin again. This is controversial to say the least, but it's, he's a very, very well-known physicist, mathematician who makes this speculation. What he does is that he takes a mathematical transformation. If you look at the state of the universe at the end state, mathematically, there's a great similarity between that and the moment of the Big Bang. He says if it's mathematically true, then it should be physically true. That's a really interesting question. So.
Okay, thank you. So along those lines, as a physicist, first of all, do you ever get that question? Or how would you respond if somebody said to you, does the universe really have a purpose?
Well, science has no answer to that question. And there are different, scientists come in all religious flavors. And those who are religious will say, well, yes, that has a purpose. So for instance, if you look at Genesis, okay, so Genesis, starting with chapter 1, verse 2, Genesis really conforms with the cosmology of the day, which is that there's a firmament, the firmament separates the waters above from the waters below. Then it makes a statement in Genesis 1:1, God created the heavens and the earth. Which really transcends the cosmology of the Egyptians and the Greek cosmology, cosmology at the time. So what caused the Big Bang? Where did it come from? At the moment, about the best thing we can say is, well, it's a boundary condition on the universe. What brought about that boundary condition? Deism says, well, there was a God who started everything and then has disappeared and just lets everything run down. But scientifically, there's no answer to that question at the moment.
Okay. It's interesting, though, as a physicist, as a scientist, and as a Baha'i, getting that question. Thanks. One other thing, you do mention on that slide, creation has always existed. And often when we are talking about these topics, often get creation and the universe a little bit mixed up. Can you maybe expand on that?
Well, if there is so the universe, we've now come to think the universe is that which we have access to. So if there is such a thing as a multiverse, then we have according to current ideas, we have no access to these other universes that might exist. And the universe also, though, there could be regions of the universe that we will never have access to. So the creation involves basically, hypothetically, a multiplicity of universes, which may or may not exist. We have no idea whether that's true. One thing I'd like to mention, one of the questions which was raised by one of the participants, I just noticed, is the question is, well, the James Webb recent images from the James Webb throws doubt on inflation. How does that affect it? Well, the Big Bang is a pretty solid paradigm. It pretty much exists. There are many physicists in the world, cosmologists, who don't believe in inflation. Roger Penrose doesn't believe in it, for instance. George Ellis doesn't believe in it. So inflation was sort of developed as a way to resolve certain seeming inconsistencies. And inflation may or may not have happened. If the James Webb Telescope indicates that inflation did not happen, that's quite significant, but it does not change the overall picture that we currently have, physical picture of the universe beginning at a point singularity and then expanding out from there.
Great. Okay, thanks. So one final question for you, Robert. Can you expand on what does it mean when we say, or like revelation has or will contribute towards cosmology? So how will our religion contribute towards the science of cosmology?
Well, that is a very good question. I think the contribution is more in the area of the phenomenon of emergence. So humans, we were created, according to Baha'i belief, we were created to understand the universe. The universe was created to be understood. Therefore, the laws of physics must be such that they will inevitably produce an intelligent species, and not just us as intelligent species. There could be intelligent species scattered throughout the universe, on stars, in galaxies scattered throughout the universe. And that would be a logical conclusion from the Baha'i writings, that we cannot be the only intelligent species in the universe. We are not. If we are not an accident, then it means that life itself is not an accident, which means the development of an intelligent species is not an accident. So the laws of the universe must be such as to lead in some way to the creation of life, and then from life to the development of an intelligent species. And so we should look deeply into chaos theory, for instance, into complexity theory. We should look deeply into that, expecting to find some kind of a drive towards the production of us. And this can be a stimulus to science. If we think, well, it's hopeless, we're just accidents in the universe, there's no point in even looking. So often the questions one asks determine the direction that will be taken to find the answers. So if we ask the question, well, if we are inevitable, there must be something in science to show that life is inevitable. And if we look for it, if it's not there, of course, we won't find it. But if we don't look for it, we will certainly not find it.
That's right. Okay, good. You know, I don't think you could have answered this any different as a great segue into our next speaker. And so it is kind of a continuation of what you just said, Robert. Thank you very much. I could sit there and chat with you all day. Okay. Our second
speaker. There's just one brief thing I'd like to say quickly.
Sure.
We know that the laws of the universe are such that heavy elements will be produced. We know that absolutely. Will the heavy elements produce life? That we don't yet know. Anyway, I'm sorry. So go on.
Okay. So we have a lot of unknowns yet. Yeah. Good. Thanks very much, Robert. I've enjoyed this immensely. Our next speaker is Roger Naiman. And Roger is an independent scholar, faculty member of the Science, Religion, and the Baha'i Faith course through Wilmette. And Roger has devoted himself to the field of promoting harmony. This comes from his conviction that science and spirituality are both valid and compelling avenues to finding the truth about the world at large and about human nature and the human condition. He developed a deep interest in the history and furthering the dialogue between the creationists and atheistic neo-Darwinism. Today, he will speak on evolutionary insights from the Baha'i teachings and their relevance to issues facing humanity. Roger, please help me welcome Roger Naiman.
Well, hello, Charlotte, thank you. This is a topic near and dear to my heart, because when I look into the depths of time that evolution awakens us to see, a little bit of eternity reflects back. And I find it to be poetic and inspiring to look out upon, say, a forest landscape and to see that the philosophy of evolution and the science of evolution, in fact, relates us to all other living things in a very real way. When you look at how the theory of evolution came to be and what issues it addressed, one of those was the question of deep time. And in fact, it was the concept of millions upon millions upon millions, thousands of millions of years passing in Earth's history that made it possible for Darwin to see that living forms, which appear to be so permanent, themselves undergo changes. So whereas the offspring is very much like the parent, and the form seems to be dictated and permanent, evolution teaches us that forms are changing and mutable. So it has an odd effect on our minds because we have to look below appearances to see a deeper reality and a deeper truth. And so it's not surprising that it's evolution where those who seek to find opportunities to foment or to perpetuate the idea that there's an inherent conflict between science and religion, they settle on the question of evolution to provoke sharp arguments. And in fact, that's where we see a time arise where atheists will present what religionists have to say in the worst possible light so that they can refute it. And similarly, people who take a very literal view of some particular scripture will present what the scientists have to say. But Baha'u'llah's principle for us that religion and science must be in harmony because truth is one, as Robert has laid out for us. Make it clear that if we stand in the center and we embrace science, and yet we know that our stream of revelation and information that's coming to us provides valid truths about the world, and we are driven to create a framework that lets us see a deeper truth and a reality underneath the surface. And that's where the Baha'i teachings on evolution are very refreshing, because it's the only faith explicitly embrace revelation. I mean, the idea and principle and fact of evolution from the very outset. And it is also one that robustly stands for the idea that it is all created by God. Robert mentioned the book of the world and the book of nature. When we see that nature is the expression of God's will, a study of evolution begins to reveal how God's creative force goes on to create more and more forms. So God created not only a world in a certain shape, but a world that continually reshapes itself. And we, deep in our nature, are out of that same process. So we can understand our animal nature better by understanding how it came out of the natural world. And evolution is one of the best clues for that. And when we look through to understand where our spiritual guidance comes from and how our spiritual path is starting to unfold as we create and are in turn created by an ever-advancing civilization, then we see that there are many kinds of evolution at work. So when we speak of evolution, we're usually talking about biological evolution. And yet we also need to acknowledge that the whole cosmos is evolving, and that our culture is evolving, our language and our understanding. And as we look deeper into the nature of science, and Stephen will talk about this a little bit later, we see that our understanding evolves as we progress and grow. So this is the right topic to help us understand ourselves better, and to also, it's a good avenue to help address the truth that science and religion are in harmony if we deal with the difficult questions of evolution. And with that, I'll turn back to Charlotte.
Wow. Thanks so much, Roger. And I know that's also very difficult for you to talk about this topic, because I know how passionate you are about it. Oh, just a minute, I'll turn on my video. There we go. And I know how passionate you are about this topic, so thank you very much. And this is one of the units in the Science and Religion course, so there will be much to say about this particular topic. And so I have a question for you, Roger. Out of all the topics in science, why are you interested in this particular topic?
Wow, it goes back to my early days when I first read about, at first I started out reading about science and the stars and spaceships and science fiction and things. But the next thing I read about was evolution. And I got the bug for it. I thought, there's something beautiful here. I mean, as Darwin says, there's a certain grandeur in this vision of things. And there is. And then I heard people fighting with each other because I believed in God and I believed in a certain inner connection to God and the reality, spiritual reality that sets people around me. And here were people coming up saying the two things I loved were incompatible with each other. It's like mommy and daddy fighting, you know, I got kind of upset. So for me, it was an insane fight to preserve the unity of the world inside myself and in my own heart. And this began long before I became a Baha'i.
Thanks. I think we, oh, there he is. There he's back again. You know, Roger, there, yeah, you're back.
That particular division in the world is not real, it's not permanent, and so I'm going to stand and face it and try to understand why it appears to be here when it shouldn't be.
Yeah, wonderful. You know, I never heard of that analogy, but it's like your mother and father fighting, and I think that's where it really resonated with me, because I do have a love for science and religion, and really it's all part of our family. And so I thank you for that analogy. So you mentioned before the framework, you talk about evolution. It really is very timely. It opens up getting to know our physical reality, our animalistic reality, understanding evolution. So why is evolution important for humanity? I know you talked about it, but why is it timely, especially now?
Well, I'll give just one line of reasoning and evidence very briefly, because there's many ways to pick up that answer. But just think about how important it is for us to do better at communicating to each other and getting science right. However you stand on the issues and questions and facts and things, you have to acknowledge that we've been at odds with ourselves. If we think of all of humanity, we've been at odds with ourselves at how to understand and apply science. And we haven't yet found a way to listen to each other and to talk the right words so that we can reach a unified standpoint. And when you delve into the questions about why that's so, and you start to get into the science of how people reason and how they understand each other and how we talk, how we form allegiances and how we learn who to trust, then it turns, the reasoning makes you look at how we evolved. Because we evolved to live in small tribal bands, and we tend to form trust alliances in small groups. And then once we have a trust alliance, we tend to instinctively follow whatever that, basically it's a prejudice. Not all, I mean, having a quick answer is very, very helpful. So our reasoning, part of our reasoning is based on the quick interactions that are founded in a small group of people. And when you really understand and we recognize that we are all cast in that same mold, evolution helps shape us in how we think. Culture teaches us how to rise above that. So understanding our history becomes a critical element to unlocking the key to the future.
Mhm. Thank
Okay.
you for that. And certainly with what's happening now, people are establishing themselves in groups. So I can understand why this is very timely to discuss this particular topic. And then you alluded a little bit to the future. So where will this topic take us in the future, or what vistas are going to be opened up for us?
Humanity co-evolves with our tool set and with our culture. So as we recognize the future unfolding, we have to also take more responsibility to become co-creators with God of what the world is, because evolution teaches us that humanity has become broadly influential, where we dominate the environment. We're starting to affect the evolution of other plants and animals. We have been for thousands of years. And now we're making it difficult for many ecosystems to continue because of our technical activities. So hurry up, let's become aware of our own selves, let's become aware of our own thinking process so that we can take ownership that we already have. We can consciously recognize what we already have. And then we can become co-creators of a brilliant and beautiful future.
Wow.
And I think that's what religion is really all about. So,
Thank
but it has to be in keeping with science. So
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Roger. On that note, you did mention culture a couple of times and how important culture is, which is a great segue to our next speaker. Thanks so much, Roger. And I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Whitney Kasminapur, sorry. Whitney has a PhD in anthropology, and she's also a faculty member of the Wilmette Science, Religion, and the Baha'i Faith course. She has an interest in cultures and studies questions such as how cultures might evolve towards higher spiritual goals, how will insights generated through psycho-cultural anthropology help us better understand the revelation of Baha'u'llah. Whitney will give us insights from her background of an anthropologist on the topic of harmonizing Baha'i consultation with social scientific insights to foster effective decision-making and social justice. So please help me welcome Whitney.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. It's so exciting to be here with all of you. I know that there are people coming from all around the world, and I'm not even in my own home place. I'm in a 100-year-old, refurbished, beautiful Greek home on the island of Lesbos. So I'm thinking a lot about traveling. And I've been thinking about how Abdu'l-Baha traveled and traveled the world as soon as he could and gave a lot of talks. He gave sometimes when he traveled to Europe and the United States, he spoke sometimes twice a day, which is really remarkable. One of the things that is interesting when we look at his talks is that he has selected a subset of the Baha'i Faith that he wanted to present to these societies. And he presents them as certain central tenets of the Baha'i Faith. And he often included the harmony of science and religion as one of those tenets. And a lot of us are familiar with this kind of loose outline that Abdu'l-Baha used, saying that, maybe there are 12 tenets or 9 tenets that he wanted to go over in these talks. But I wanted to point out to you that it's not just the harmony of science and religion that he presented in this outline of major tenets of the faith, but it was the need for religion to be harmonized with science. So there are many different kinds of relationships that the harmony of science and religion can and probably does imply, but one of them is in this direction. It's that religion needs to be harmonized with science. Abdu'l-Baha mentions that if we don't harmonize religion with science, we risk turning it into superstition, into ignorance, into an attachment to ceremonies and traditions that distracts us from the inner forms and the inner meanings of religion towards the outer forms. And that this lack of harmony of religion with science causes the religion to lack influence, causes discord, hatred, and disunity, and it causes reasonable people to conclude that science and religion are at odds with one another. Now, I bet a lot of you, like me, when we initially thought of the harmony of science and religion or the disharmony of science and religion, for those of us who are not physicists, like two of my panelists, the first thing that comes to my mind is the situation with Galileo. So Galileo was perhaps the most brilliant person alive at his time, the most brilliant scientist alive at his time. And the Roman Catholic Church misinterpreted metaphoric scripture to condemn Galileo and actually put him under house arrest for the rest of his life. So one of the two common responses to what I'm identifying as something that a lot of us think of when we think of the disharmony of science and religion, one response might be for people to conclude, well, religion is just an impediment to science and reason, and so to discount religion's influence. Another more charitable view of how one could reconcile this, more charitable towards religion, would be to say, well, these are complementary systems of knowledge that really the Roman Catholic Church fathers had no business evaluating scientific data. That was really way beyond their skill set. And so these religion and science should be just completely complementary, separate, stay in their own corners kind of systems. But I don't think that that's really what all that Abdu'l-Baha was implying when he said that religion should be harmonized with science, that it should just stay in its own corner. So since the time of Galileo, and really since the time of Baha'u'llah, there has arisen a series of scientific disciplines that investigate not just kind of more arcane topics like whether the earth goes around the sun for theology, but topics that are really central to the claims of religions. And those are the social sciences. So neither Baha'u'llah nor Abdu'l-Baha, as far as I've been able to find, are mentioning the social sciences specifically, but that's really not surprising since most of them arose in the late 19th century. Shoghi Effendi, when asked by students what to study, he often answered with an answer that studying history or sociology or economics would be really beneficial, which, as an aside, that's kind of a really good description of a more humanistic to quantitative description range of the disciplines of the social sciences. So the Universal House of Justice, in their recent guidance, I'm going to show a slide here, they use social science terms all the time. So let me bring this up. And let's see, oh gosh. Let's go from there. So in their December, just picking at random, my favorite recent letter, the December 30th, 2021 letter from the Universal House of Justice to the counselors. I'm going to just point out some of the really social sciencey terms that they're using. They're talking about the society building power of the faith, the three interlocking protagonists of the individual, community, and institutions. They're talking about the need for a stable social order and what causes that. They're talking in a couple points about social environments and needing to analyze social environments. The House talks about the social, economic, and cultural barriers that impede people's spiritual and material progress. The House talks about an area's prevailing social problems as something that needs to be analyzed by Baha'is, as well as the aspirations of its people to overcome them. And finally, I'll just point out that the House talks about inherited customs and attitudes. So that would really be right in the realm of culture, and that includes prejudices of all kinds and the opiate of consumerism. So the Universal House of Justice is really using a lot of social science terms and a lot of theory and models that are very consistent with social science. So just in the December 30th letter, if there's anyone out there who's like a grad student in social sciences, I'd say there's at least 75 to 100 really great research questions that you could just turn some of the sentences into. For example, about society building power, you could ask, what is society? What are its components, universally or in a specific situation? What is meant by society building? What builds society versus what causes it or allows it to degenerate? And in what way does the Baha'i revelation build society? In which direction, which kind? So it's just a very rich social science environment in the guidance from the Universal House of Justice. So I'm arguing here that we really need to include in our understanding of the harmony of science and religion, particularly the harmonizing of religion with science, all of the social sciences, because the social sciences have long histories of existing conversations in various fields, in these various disciplines, with existing empirical studies that can be drawn on and compared, a discussion of appropriate methods to generate data and to analyze data. And so in short, there are really important insights that Baha'is need to be drawing on. So to wrap up, what I'm implying here is that there are these many different ways to think about the harmony of science and religion, and the different ways are really important to meditate upon for all of us. But one that we need to pay attention to is this harmonization of religion with science. Abdu'l-Baha said in Paris that God made religion and science to be the measure, as it were, of our understanding. And he advised us to take heed that ye neglect not such a wonderful power. The vibrancy of religion, the vibrancy of the Baha'i faith, of our social action, of the development of our virtues, of our contribution to discourse, and of our acts of service are really dependent on us harmonizing our activity with science, especially with the social sciences that have so much overlap with these topics. And so with that plea, I want to just wrap up and let Charlotte ask some questions so we can follow up on some of these issues.
Thanks so much, Whitney. I'm really glad you mentioned the students that might even be on, and what a great opportunity. If you join our course, you'll have 4 great faculty members to discuss ongoing research papers. So thanks, Whitney. You did talk about harmonizing science and religion, and you gave us some good reasons for that. So what about how will this harmonizing with studying culture contribute to social justice?
Well, I think that that social justice is oftentimes surrounding issues around groups that are, it's really about groups that are non-hegemonic, that are being oppressed in various ways. And this can range from really overt discrimination to very subtle unconscious activity that can be beyond our consciousness. And the social sciences and psychology have done extensive work in these topics. And I think it's really important for us to, for example, just make sure that we understand the history of social injustice and how how it reverberates in the current time. I'm thinking right now of a neighborhood in which I teach children's classes, and we invited the parents of the children who attend the classes to come and just share with us their vision for the community. This is a community that's had children's classes running in there for about 15 years. So we thought this would be, they might have some insight that were along the lines that we were expecting. But it was really interesting. The mothers came in, and it's a primarily Mexican American community, a poor community, rich spiritually, but economically poor. And they were all talking about how when there is gang activity in their neighborhood and they call the police don't respond, they don't come. And they were just concluding that this had to do with the police being maybe overburdened. Maybe the police didn't understand how important it was, but we were able to use some insights from social science and realize that there may be some discrimination going on, we discovered that the non-Hispanic people who were calling into the police were getting responses. And it was just these parents who were Mexican American and undocumented who were not getting responses. So it's very helpful to even ask the question that there is discrimination going on, and what can we do for this community given that?
Okay, that's really a great example. And then you would use those research questions to provide that answer. Very good. So you did talk about religion, and you stressed this. The religion needs to harmonize with science. So that means religion will be developed with the help of social science. So can you expand a little bit on that concept?
Yeah, I think Stephen's going to be speaking a lot about the definition of the scientific method, but I want to get back to kind of a flexible idea of what science is, and that's that it's a collective, systematic, logical approach to thinking that's very sensitive to empirical data, to going out into the world and seeing whether our hypotheses work or not. And I think that that's a very important meditative, maybe, activity in relationship to all of our lives as Baha'is who want to affect the world and improve the world. I mean, it helps for reading reality. There have been a lot of hardworking, smart people systematically approaching understanding social reality, and it's really worthwhile to understand that, and that will help us decide how to act in the world, to try to pursue acts of service and intervention into the world to make it a better place. I think it's very important in terms of reflection. There's a lot of emphasis from the House on reflecting on our actions and using that as a source of information for our actions, but also for our understanding, that it broadens our understanding. I think that it would really be worthwhile for Baha'i communities, for example, just to get linked into the extensive social science on evaluation. As a very concrete and simple example, I've seen a lot of communities make the mistake of asking at feast if this is a good time for feast, because they want more people to attend feast. Well, the simple insight is that those are not the people you need to ask. If you want to expand the number of people who are attending, you need to ask the people who aren't attending.
Right.
So that helps us read our reality. It helps us understand how effective we are. And all of these insights, the better that we can read reality, the better that we can understand our actions on the world, also reflect back into our understanding even of the revelation itself. So we have multiple possible understandings, within a range of the guidance, and that we need to work through. So we might have really basic, broad hermeneutics of tenets, like we understand that women and men have been and always will be equal in the sight of God. But what does that actually mean? What does that look like in terms of parenting? What does that look like in terms of businesses and economics? That we will sharpen our understanding of the revelation as we sharpen our understanding of reality as well.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Whitney.
Thank you, Charlotte.
And speaking, also another great segue into our next speaker. Speaking of understanding, our final speaker today is Stephen Freiberg. Stephen is also a faculty member of the Science, Religion, and the Baha'i Faith course. Stephen has been fascinated by science and religion since becoming a Baha'i in his youth. He went on to graduate with a PhD in physics at the University of Rochester in 1985 in the field of quantum entanglement. He went on to starting the Association of Baha'i Studies, Science and Religion, the Special Interest Group in the US, and he continues to pursue the topic of the harmony of science and religion. He's a perfect candidate to speak about the scientific method, diversity, and Baha'i consultation. Please help me welcome Stephen.
I'm going to talk today about the scientific method, science as a social process, diversity as enhancing objectivity, and consultation. That's a big order. That's like the whole scientific revolution and half a reality. So I'm going to have to talk briefly. In 1933, Shoghi Effendi wrote to the British High Commissioner for Palestine saying that the revelation proclaimed by Baha'u'llah, his followers believed, is divine in origin, all-embracing in scope, broad in its outlook, scientific in its method, humanitarian in its principles, and dynamic in the influence it exerts. What does it mean for the revelation of Baha'u'llah to be scientific in its method? And another set of questions is, what does philosophy, history, and the sociology of science say? What about consultation and learning and action in Baha'i communities? The scientific method was once pictured as a kind of step-by-step textbook process. You took data, you used it to develop a thesis by induction, you deduced what experiments you needed to do, then you did those experiments, then you adjusted the thesis. This is no longer the perspective. There's now broad agreement, and this is a quote from Naomi Oreskes, who's a leading historian of science. There's now broad agreement among historians, philosophers, sociologists, and anthropologists of science that there's no singular scientific method, and that scientific practice consists of communities of people making decisions for reasons that are both empirical and social using diverse methods. According to Naomi, social aspects of science are baked in. There is not just one scientific method. That is the consensus of philosophers of science these days. Susan Hack, who's one of the leading philosophers of science, talks about science as critical common sense. Science works in ways that are similar to other forms of inquiry, but it differs in the degree to which it requires a broad and detailed background knowledge and a familiarity with a technical vocabulary that only specialists may possess. There is no uniquely rational mode of inference or procedure of inquiry used by all, she says. Rather, there are many and various different scientific methods constantly evolving. Paul Hüningen-Hühne, who's a German philosopher of science, sees science as rules of procedure and systematicity. The special status of science, he argues, is not due to a unique scientific method or even scientific methods, but rules of procedure. Scientific knowledge differs from other kinds of knowledge, especially from everyday knowledge, by its higher degree of systematicity. The whole of science, he says, is nothing more than a systemization of everyday thinking. And a lot of people outside of the sciences are thinking along these lines. Bill Hatcher, well, he has some interesting points of view. The modern understanding of science shows strong affinities with the descriptions of science given by Dr. William Hatcher, a Baha'i mathematician and Platonist philosopher, writing 50 years ago. The scientific method, he says, is the systematic, organized, directed, and conscious use of our various mental faculties in an effort to arrive at a coherent model, whatever phenomena is being investigated. Although we may refine and elaborate our description in various top areas of research like mathematics, logic, or physics, the scientific method is basically a description of how we've learned to approach topics to yield benefits and so on and so forth, how to use our mental faculties. Very interesting point of view. One of the things that people are bringing to the table with respect to science is that it's a social process. The philosopher of science Helen Longino at Stanford argues that the development of knowledge is a necessarily social rather than individual activity, and it is the social character of scientific knowledge that both protects it from and renders it vulnerable to social and political interests and values. The social nature of scientific practice then means it's produced by a community. Then in a way that's very reminiscent of the Baha'i Writings, she says, once prepositions, theses, and hypotheses are developed, what will become of scientific knowledge is produced collectively through the clashing and meshing of a variety of points of view. I didn't put that in there, she put that in there. Diversity, it turns out, is very powerful as a method to enhance objectivity. This is one of the most significant findings in the philosophy of science these days. And diversity is increasingly seen as necessary for valid objective knowledge. And it's from the feminist philosophy of science. I think the reason to see that way are that people have different biases and perspectives depending upon their backgrounds and world views, and those are going to affect how they judge data or theories and things like this. So if you want to get rid of narrow perspectives for judging data, then you have to balance them by differing points of view. This is best done, Longino says, by women and men from a variety of differing backgrounds with different points of view. So I might have to skip this because I'm running out of time, but science, according to developments we have described, is the result of systematic effort by scientific specialists. But what about non-specialists? When we look at consultation and learning and action, which is encouraged by the revelation of Baha'u'llah and the Universal House of Justice, we see emerging a democratic form of science that applies widely. It applies to everybody. All can and should engage in those methods. So what does that mean for the question about the nature of the revelation of Baha'u'llah and why it's scientific in its method? My thinking is that what Shoghi Effendi said is a statement that's both very wide and very powerful. It's telling us to look at both sides of science and relation and revelation and see how they're related. And I would go a step farther. As we become increasingly able to see how they're related, we can have more powerful uses of these two powerful methods. So I conclude by saying the revelation of Baha'u'llah as scientific in its method urges on us a systematic engagement with scientific progress and understanding, and an understanding that science, suitably understood as a method for everybody to use in consultation and learning and action, as well as by scientific community, is a part of the revelation of God, and a power further imbued into science by the revelation of Baha'u'llah. So that kind of wraps up what I wanted to say. Back to you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I really appreciated this PowerPoint and for you going through this difficult topic of answering, is there only one scientific method? You did talk about the role of diversity, and you also mentioned in one of the slides, maybe you can stop the presentation for now, and then we can see your, there we go, good. One of the things that you did talk about was communities of people. Now, should I be worried if there was, let's just say, a majority of materialistic perspective, and that is the community of people? Wouldn't it be like majority of people believe this, so therefore, should I be worried about something like that?
Let me see if I can capture the essence of what you're saying. Should you be worried if there's a community of materialists who decide to dictate scientific reality? And my answer is no, because not what a community of materialists decides is not science. It might be framed cast in the kind of pseudoscience way, but that doesn't mean that it's science. So we have to be able to distinguish between what's scientific and what's not. And I think one of the best ways to do that for the broader world community is be engaging in consultation and learning in action. In other words, if people have moved science into some kind of specialist regime, maybe companies, maybe universities and things like this, and are not engaging in science in their regular, ordinary, everyday lives, then they're going to be, they can be captured by pseudoscientific understandings. Whereas if they're using science or scientific methods or the rational ways of thinking, then they have perspective that can see through materialist pseudoscience.
Okay, good. I'm going to ask you a very similar question I asked Whitney. Considering you did mention this, the learning that the Baha'i community, we are on a learning path. How will science help the Baha'is better read our reality?
Science allows you to do a couple of things. One of the things it allows you to do is look up what everybody's kind of figured out works and what doesn't work. Or so, for example, in reading reality in Mountain View, California, we're noticing that a lot of people can't get housing. So a big part of the dominating ideas with respect to our local reality is that homelessness and people not able to live here. And we can see that with our own eyes, but also we can look at what the scientific communities are saying about the issue. And that buttresses our understanding of the issues. So science has a very important theme of being able to give you access to knowledge. But from another point of view, you can also use scientific methods to try to investigate reality yourself.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I know, it brings back the notion back from science when we took science in grade 8, that scientific method was you form a question, hypothesis, do an experiment. And I think that's what we were taught when we were back in high school. So is there, and I know we're expanding very much on science further to that. So is there something we can do to help the next generation improve their ability to study and understand the scientific way of gaining knowledge?
Wow, that's a great question. I think that in the Baha'i community, there are already ongoing efforts to bring an understanding of the importance of the harmony of science and religion to bear in teaching advanced high school students and university students and graduate students in the ISGP program. So that's a part of that program. As we start to engage in dialogues with our local communities, very often it really kind of opens the door to an understanding of the importance of science. The next steps can we provide systematic education in science and science, the harmony of science and religion in some courses that maybe can be offered through the Wilmette Institute or through other venues. I think that that's a door that's opening wide to us, and we should think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we would can definitely do that. Now, considering there's only 20 minutes of our time left, and there might be some of our attendees interested in asking questions. So if you're able, the panel members, Whitney, Roger, Robert, maybe show your faces, because we don't know who the questions that will come from the attendees will go to. Thank you, Andres. Andres is also a teaching assistant for the Science and Religion course. He has a background in philosophy of science. So he will field those questions as he's been studying them as they've been coming in. Go ahead, Andres.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. We have one question that came during your presentation, Robert, but I think anyone who has some insights are welcome to contribute. Baha'u'llah describes God as an unknowable essence. One way to think about this might be that the reality of God or the universe is infinite. Therefore, is it fair to say that despite our advancement in cosmology, we are still very far away, infinitely far from the ultimate truth?
Well, I would say basically, yes. There are some caveats to that. So fundamentally, physics, at least physics cosmology, deals with things on two levels. One level is it looks at the fundamentals. You know, what are the fundamental laws? What's the fundamental structure of matter? Secondly, it looks at emergence. And we're just beginning to gain, mathematicians are just beginning to gain the ability, the power to study emergent properties. So for instance, a big, thick book I had some time ago, the book was on teaching people who do financial mathematics about the path integral approach, which is used to study quantum systems. It says, look, we can use the mathematics of path integral approach to study financial systems. You know, so we have this incredible mathematical apparatus which can be used to study an emergent phenomenon, which is far, far, far away from elementary particles. So science really is infinite. At the same time, the fundamental understanding of matter is particle physics and relativity, and these two are incompatible. There are undoubtedly surprises that lie in store for us in order to mesh these two. They might give us a different picture of the universe. So there's no question that you know, but at the same time, though, science reaches levels of stasis, which for some time people think, well, everything's pretty much consolidated in one big picture. Then changes take place, new experiments, and oh, there's an actual deeper picture underlying that, which really consolidates everything into this deeper picture. So this I see is going to be an eternal process over the next 500,000 years. You know, we don't know how long any particular picture will remain. It might remain for 300 or 400 years, our picture of cosmology, but there are underlying realities underneath that, undoubtedly.
Thank you very much, Robert. This next question is directed primarily towards you, Whitney, and it's asking, given the relative impacts today of science, religion, and business on the earth, would it make sense to talk of the harmony of the three of those? And it's mentioned briefly business in the sense that the behavior and actions of corporations don't seem to be reducible to the mindsets of its individual members.
I think that's a wonderful question because it highlights such an important force in our world. Not just important because it's affecting a lot of the current day, but it's also shaping and limiting, possibly limiting our future. So I'm so happy that Wade raised this interesting force that we should understand and shape. I think that what we want to look at maybe is the corporation as an object of study and influence through the harmony of science and religion. I wouldn't raise a corporation to be a system of understanding, but rather it's more, it's maybe the corporations have elements of community, in that they generate culture. They have cognition, and there's some really interesting research about collective cognition. So there's sort of a cognitive emergence to them. And they have a lot of influence. So there's a lot of power that needs to be analyzed through this. So I think that we want to look at it as the science and religion are these two powerful forces that help us gauge reality, as well as build our futures, identify what our responsibilities are, what ethics are, and what we want to do with the situation of our world being so powerfully and frighteningly shaped by these large corporations. So thank you so much for that question, Wade.
Mm-hmm. It is very good. So Robert and Stephen, go ahead. You want to respond to this question?
I wanted to draw a brief analogy with physics. So as I see it, the element of the social sciences is the individual human being. And we have communities, we have institutions. These are really emergent phenomena that arise out of the elements. So by studying the individual human being, you really don't get much insight into how institutions behave. So to me, it's really a matter of the development of the social sciences, where they see these institutions as being emergent phenomena and study it on the level of emergence. So for instance, I cannot understand solid state physics by looking at the laws of quantum mechanics. I mean, the laws that govern elementary particles. I have to look at solid state on its own level. It's an emergent property. In the same way, it's part of science to look at the emergent property of institutions, corporations being an institution. So that's sort of partly my perspective on that.
There you go. Now we heard of one physicist on the culture in organizations. Now we'll hear from the other one. Stephen, go ahead.
I've worked I worked for AT&T, I worked for NTT in Japan, and I worked for corporations in Silicon Valley. I tell everybody that half my neighbors work for Google, half my neighbors work for Apple, and half my neighbors work for Facebook. So the question that Wade brings up is really a central one and very, very important one. And these three corporations that I mentioned based here in Silicon Valley have such a major impact on the way the world works. And I think that, you know, we've got people in our Baha'i community who are starting to look at those. I think it's a really important issue to look at more. And I would encourage anybody who wants to look at these kind of issues with us, join us in our course. We have a whole unit on questions about technology, because mostly these corporations are involved in technology. We're missing people who know about, biology and biochem and things like this, which are major component of corporations in here and have to do with health. These are wide open fields. We need to explore them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you very
And
much,
Robert,
Stephen. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Andrew.
All right, so we have actually multiple attendees who I think will be mostly directed to you, Stephen, are asking for clarification on the idea that there is no distinctive scientific method, and how do we prevent this from sliding into postmodern relativism?
What a wonderful question. I was thinking about this because I know some people are very comfortable with this idea that there's no one scientific method. But it's the empirical aspects of modern studies of science studies, for example, which is a kind of branch of sociology, which look at the sciences, and you take your data, you look at what the data says, and the data says that there's no one scientific method. What's behind the unity of science and Shoghi Effendi's insistence that the revelation is scientific in its method is that we have to understand more fully what these terms mean. And I think we need to reach out over to philosophy of science. I think it was Paul Lample or perhaps Farzam Arbab who urged us to start looking at the philosophy of science. So we need to start to think about and research what other people are saying about these things, people who have spent whole careers and developed a sophisticated body of knowledge. What do they say about these kind of things? Clearly, rational study and experiment are part of any kind of consistent scheme. I think Whitney said it really, really nicely. I was kind of glowing when she talked about that. But maybe get some other opinions. I think Roger has his hand up.
Yeah.
I may err on the side of taking a long view.
Just a minute, Roger,
And
before you go
asking
on further, maybe turn your video off. Your sound is a little choppy.
Okay, I think perhaps I err in terms of the big picture and the long view, but I ask myself, where will science be in 1,000 years? And where will our theories be in 1,000 years? And it seems clear to me that the most profound difference will be that we have a much deeper appreciation of how spiritual matters intersect with objectivity. And I think that that implies that we'll have something of a theory of the individual. And I view that as such a radical transformation of how science works today that I appreciate that the deepest insights that can be gleaned from these kinds of questions are just beyond the reach of anything we're close to. We're moving from a natural science that sees things as objectivity and mistook the importance of opinions and thoughts to discussing social sciences, which take into account that there are groups of people with views, and Longino points to us our scientific method as it's important to take those things into account. But when it gets really deep down to it, we're not getting much closer yet to any sort of theory of consciousness or spirit or personhood. And that's ultimately required. So for now, I think we have to take an incremental, wait and see, experimental approach without seeking finality. And I think that's the ultimate answer, that there's process involved here and not just any dream of a final theory.
Okay. Thanks, Roger, for taking us 1,000 years into the future. Go ahead, Robert.
So I really, really like Roger Stephen's PowerPoint, and I actually would like to have it included in the course, that PowerPoint as is, pretty much as is. And I really like Roger's comments. But I'd like to draw an analogy, if I may. I approach somebody and I say, mankind is one. He says, how can you possibly say that? We're all unique. Yes, we're all unique, but mankind is one. So I would rather say, rather than this is not the scientific method, this initial thing Stephen presented, I'd rather say, well, it's a cartoon. Cartoons have an aspect of reality to them, but they are cartoons. So there are some people, there are some aspects of science, they follow that procedure, hypothesis, induction, deduction, and so on. So it's not wrong, it's a cartoon. There are a family of methods. Within that family of method, there is a scientific method. To me, it's a matter of semantics partly. Just like we're all humanity, we're all human. No, we're all individual. Of course we are. We're all unique, of course, but we're all human beings as well. So that's how I would tend to look at it.
Thanks, Robert. So you mentioned the course. I'm just going to interrupt for just 2 minutes. I know we have many more questions. I'm just going to share a PowerPoint and Stephen will speak to the course that was mentioned. So just give me 1 second to share my screen. Okay, go ahead, Stephen.
So I wanted to invite everybody to consider joining us in our course, which starts August 18th, very in the very near future. And what we will do is kind of like what you're seeing us doing here. We kind of formed this kind of structure because it kind of duplicated what we found successful in the course, which is people talking to each other, people having meaningful conversations. So if you like these kind of meaningful conversations, I strongly encourage you to consider attending this course. We have great discussions.
Yes, we do. Okay.
So I think you've seen a bit. We touched a little bit about some of these issues. Roger, Robert, Whitney, some of the things we haven't talked about, but which we are going to touch on in the course is technology, and then science and religion in the crisis of our age. And then I think you cannot talk about these topics these days without talking about discourse and social action. As we start to talk to people in the wider community, we start to learn what questions they're asking, what issues they see are important. Social action sometimes is available to us, but just talking with our friends, talking with people in our professions and things like this, and sharing some of these approaches that we're talking about here in the Baha'i community is a powerful thing to do.
Yeah. Good. And there is the link, and just I'm pretty sure we can Google Wilmette Institute and just go through the process of finding where the course is and register. If there's any questions, respond to somebody on the website or to any one of us.
Whitney has posted, Nicola has posted the link.
There she has. Yes, the link is in the chat. So save that link so that when we leave, you won't lose the link. And I'm just going to, before Andres has another question, just a thought about the question about consultation. How are we going to get people to consult in the topics of science? And as Stephen said, this will be discussed in our course as well. We are running very, very close to 12:30, and there are many more questions. The panel are willing to stay behind a little bit. And so thank you. I'm just going to say our goodbyes if anybody has to leave after this hour and a half. And thank you very much for our panel members for offering your expertise and staying behind to answer any of those questions. Thank you, Andres, and thank you, Robert. And we have a wonderful tech support Boyd in the background as well. So if people are able to stay, by all means, stay a little bit and we can hear more questions and responses from our panel members. Okay, go ahead, Andres.
Here's one that anyone could answer and that we could have an entire course on, but we'll give it a try. How does science help us to explore the establishment of a divine civilization?
Great question.
We should ask Andres to answer that one. So you got Roger, and then maybe Whitney, yeah.
Okay, Roger, go ahead.
So I'll continue with my previous. How's the sound? Is it all right?
Yeah, it's good.
Good.
Yeah.
I'll continue with my previous. Part of it necessarily remains to be seen, and that's essential because we are not a finished product. Civilization is not a finished product, and there is divine guidance to move us through our personal lives, and there's divine guidance to help guide us pluralistically. From science, we know that the universe is not causally closed. It's not deterministic. We have a role to play. But we also know that we need to that our thinking, our religious thinking, which must become richer and richer and guide more and more of our lives and more of our civilization, needs to be in conformity with science. That's such an incredibly important principle. So it is an iterative process that we need to reflect deeply on and let that be part of all of our consultations, just like we're now to see that racial justice should be the watchword in all our affairs within the faith. Now, we also need to recognize that the principle of harmony with science, as Whitney pointed out, is a key factor that helps shape our discussions and discourses going forward. So an iterative process that is necessarily and essentially open and not yet finished and not yet determinable. And we need to recruit more and more people to be part of it, which implies that those people need to develop a little bit of being a scientist themselves, because the independent investigation of truth is the best possible platform from which to advance science.
Thank you very much, Roger. Robert, go ahead.
I think Whitney had something to say first. Whitney?
Whitney. Okay.
Well, I love this question. I have a fantasy that we will develop our social sciences toward like a activity of routinely asking what sorts of institutions, what sorts of communities, what sorts of cultural inputs facilitate each of the various virtues, for example, or what facilitates equity, what facilitates justice, what facilitates trustworthiness. I think that each of these questions can be taken up by people who have an interest in that and really study what can be shaped, not just in some theory about divine civilization, but what can be shaped in our actual community life, in our actual practices, our day-to-day practices, and the culture that we share and the families that we create. And if we work together on all of those aspects, all those foundations of what creates our life, I think we can facilitate the development of spiritual qualities. And similarly, I think one of the processes that just really has to be brought out is consultation, which is a brilliant process that Baha'u'llah's revelation offers us and should be developed with the help of science and social science. And then the method that we are learning increasingly from the Universal House of Justice, which is colloquially called ARCS, the action, reflection, consultation, and study. And this cycle, which is a scientific, it's a scientific method on its own, this cycle, like Roger is saying, this iterative process. So I think we've got a lot to work on, and this will bring a lot of hope to us in establishing a divine civilization.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Whitney. Go ahead, Robert.
Well, there are two quotations. That's just an excellent answer, by the way, Whitney, about the social sciences. There's a tremendous progress that yet to be made. I think the next couple of centuries will see the social sciences explode in a way we can't imagine right now, But there are two statements in the Baha'i Writings which I think relate to it. I don't, one is that every created thing has been endowed with an attribute of God. And so learning about nature teaches us about God, teaches about ourselves, because we have all the attributes of God potentially. And secondly, the statement of Baha'u'llah, I have ordained for thy training every atom in existence and the essence of all created things. For some mysterious reason, learning about nature helps train us. And I don't know quite how that process works, but I know, people who I've met who've had an amazing ability to look at nature and draw personal lessons from it have been Native Americans. And there was one person I knew who said his grandfather used to take him out to a canyon with water. He said, look at the water. Look how when the water, nothing can stop the flow of the water. The water will move. He said, you must be like the water. When you know you're right And when you know you're on the right path, you must be like the water that lets nothing stop you. Nothing can stop you. And so there's a way of drawing a lesson from nature, but there are deep lessons that we have to learn as our science advances. So for some reason, there's a strong connection between what exists in nature and what exists in our own soul, and what we learn from nature and what can train us in our own development.
Thanks, Robert. And thanks for that delicious question. Andres.
All right, we have a question here asking anyone interested to add more of your thoughts related to errors of explanation. How do we describe reality? How do we determine what's real? And how do we confirm these descriptions or models?
Okay, do we have a taker on this question?
Wow, that's a good question. Can you, I think we all can, after pondering for like a couple hours or a couple of years, we might be able to get good answers. Can you ask it slightly again?
I think that what's being asked is clarification simply on the idea of vectors or errors of explanation, and how we determine what's real according to science.
Oh, that's a good question. That's a really good question. Philosophy of science has a lot to say about this, but I suggest that we give this to one of our resident experts, Robert.
I don't know about the resident expert, but this statement is taken from Steven Weinberg, Nobel laureate Steven Weinberg, who studied fundamental physics. That was his area of study, fundamental physics. And he put it this way, he says, if you ask why, so let's say take any phenomenon in existence, why does it happen? And you keep asking why, eventually you get back to elementary particle physics and gravitation. Eventually you get back to that. So for instance, why does water flow? Well, water flows because it's made out of particles. Why do the particles exhibit viscosity? Because they have these residual electromagnetic forces. Why do they have residual electromagnetic forces? Well, because. Why? Because eventually you get back down to this. And he points out, he says, it did not have to be that way. It could have been that if you keep asking why, you get back to certain irreducible fundamental things. Like it comes either to this or it comes back to that. In other words, you keep asking why and you get a bifurcation. He says, but that's not how it's turned out. It turns out that everything goes back to particle physics and gravitational theory. Everything comes back to one central point. Now, you cannot go forward from there. That is, you cannot look at the equations of fundamental physics and then figure out a priori, well, yeah, fluid would flow, or consciousness will exist, but you can go back. So you can, okay, what causes consciousness? Well, we have atoms, we have molecules, we have tissues. What are tissues made of? Well, they're made of cells. What are cells made of? Well, they're made of atoms. You can work back. You can't go forward, but you can always work back. So this is an insight that Nobel laureate Steven Weinberg has about these errors of explanation.
Thanks, Robert. Go ahead, Roger.
So, Robert, maybe you could, before I bring in the rest of my answer, clarify if my understanding of one thing is correct. But the idea of causality in science is actually very subtle. We tend to think of correlation and interactions that are distributed across space and time and unfold in a certain thing. And almost most of physics is reversible. So the idea of causality is itself something of a subtle thing. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Robert? Okay,
Yes.
good. So man is the storytelling animal. There's the title of a great book, and there's something about it. That summary judgment is as close as modern evolutionary psychology can come to distinguishing what makes us different from the other animals. That storytelling and narrative threads, which implies a real good framework for talking about causality is intrinsic to how we encounter the world. And stories are something that we tell each other. So it also is intrinsic to how the discovery of truth is socially bound. So the arrow of explanation eventually points at us and through us to God. That's something we can only see spiritually. And it is, in fact, probably true that moral order and purpose is ultimately essential to existence. But we don't yet have the ability to ask that question in a way to get a good, sensible scientific answer. And we're a long way off from it. That doesn't make it untrue. And I think as a working assumption, that's a pretty good one for trying to build a framework of the harmony of science and religion. So I think we need to really pay attention to what question we're asking. Whenever we talk about causality and purpose, we need to pay close attention to what question we're really concerned about and sort that out. It might be several things at once. And underlying it all is, are our lives meaningful? That's about matters to most of us. And is this causality essential to the way things work, or is it incidental and sort of circumstantial and not really important? And I hate to always leave things with a sort of like, live with the question, but in fact, I think that's a pretty good approach to life.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks. Thanks so much, Roger. Stephen?
Let me quickly kind of put some buttressing or further buttressing under the very important arguments that Roger is making. I think you can argue that philosophy itself, modern European philosophy itself, is dealing with these kind of issues at its very, very core. So all of us in this course have learned a new term, epistemology. So as we start to understand the answers to these questions, we start to realize that they're at the center of the intellectual development of Western European civilization. And these particular questions, for example, are some of the questions addressed by Kant, the great German philosopher more than 200 years ago, who started to try to figure out, why do you have knowledge, given that knowledge can either arrive by rational means or by experimental means? And he came up with some great ideas about how to think about that have cascaded down the years. So because of reasons like this, because these themes are those that's been explored by philosophy, and these days the philosophy of science, I encourage further awareness of philosophy of science and its discussion of these issues.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Stephen. Go ahead, Robert.
So I'd like to just give another brief analogy about the arrows of explanation. Okay, so suppose that we have a bunch of people, they all get together, they're going to form a corporation. The purpose of the corporation is to do business. A priority, we cannot predict how that corporation is going to function. We can't do that. In other words, we cannot just put people together. People have these properties, these attributes, qualities. We cannot predict what's going to happen. However, if we look at the corporation, and let's say a corporation does things which the individual members really would not do on their own, we can ask, well, why does the corporation operate the way it does? Because the corporation is made of individuals. And individuals have this property that they will submerge their own personal morality in the morality of the group. So why do corporations act the way they do? The arrow of explanation goes back to because they're made up of individuals. You can't go forward. You can say, well, if individuals form, they will end up doing this. You can't go forward, but you can always go backward. Take any institution, ask why does it operate the way it does? It always comes back to, well, because it's composed of individuals, and individuals have these particular qualities. This is really a deep question for the social sciences, which will eventually they'll be able to answer in very profound ways, But again, the arrows of explanation can always go one way, almost never go the other way, if you see what I mean.
Thanks, Robert. So it is 15 minutes past our webinar, and I thank you all for staying a little bit longer. So Andres, I don't know if you want to pick and choose some of the questions or how we want to proceed. Are you able to stay a little bit longer, or?
I can stay a short time longer. We only have a couple of standing questions, and they look like they might be a little faster.
Okay,
the
go
first
ahead.
one is empirical science demands intellectual curiosity. How do we get past the easy button sought by many? Easy button in scare quotes.
Oh, wonderful. Is there really an easy button? Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Roger. Go ahead.
Ask yourself how you know what you think you know. And that turns out to be also the key to how do you have a heart-to-heart talk with somebody? And that turns out to be the key to how we solve most of the world's problems. So the independent investigation of the truth and sincerity, I mean, the basic virtues of basing your thoughts out of openness and honesty and your actions in love are in fact the best foundations for being most successful at being an agent for change.
Wonderful. And I just always love when the word love is used in our science and religion course. So thanks, Roger, for talking about the very important topic of love. Go ahead, Stephen.
So, see, I forgot that. So what was the question? I'm thinking about love.
Andres, you want to ask it again?
Absolutely. The question was, empirical science demands intellectual curiosity. How do we get past the easy button sought by many?
What is the easy button? I don't fully understood.
The quick answer to thinking fast and slow, making ourselves really examine the facts. So taking the quick first formulation, which is where prejudice comes in and guides our action, that's the easy button. That's thinking fast. Thinking slow means stopping and asking how I think I know what I know, and also listening to others. So the easy button is the road to prejudicial action.
So I can quickly elaborate on, it's a kind of dimension of what Roger's saying. What we can do is we can, independent investigation of the truth means that we go out and investigate by ourselves. But one of the powerful ways to investigate ourselves is to find out what the scientific or the relevant scientific community or communities are thinking, and make sure that you understand them. It's a little bit easy to think through things on your own, and then you can miss some of the manifold dimensions of the discussion. So I'd add that to what Roger said.
Thanks, Stephen. Okay, Andres, so we have one more quick question.
Yes. Here it says, did the Catholic Church acknowledge that Galileo's theories were not inconsistent with religion? Was this not a prime opportunity to incorporate science into religion? Did they aim for simplicity in avoiding the concept?
Well, okay, that's probably directed at me. And when I was putting this together, I was realizing this is way out of my depth. Galileo's out of my depth. So the physicists may be able to jump in here, but I was using more of the Galileo example as the simple thing that the non-physicists of the world probably use to think with about the harmony of science and religion. However, I did notice when I was doing a little research and using this example that there was another angle to the Galileo aspect. Galileo was supporting an existing theory. It wasn't that he originated the theory that the Earth went around the sun rather than vice versa. And the Catholic Church was accommodating his support of that until he wrote something that was offensive to the authorities. So there was some politics involved as well, which should always be questioned in my mind. Politics and power should be a question that one asks of any social situation, because oftentimes it becomes part of the equation. But of course, it was an opportunity, that maybe the politics moved the church away from something that would have been an opportunity to realize that this issue didn't really have much to do with deep questions of theology. And maybe it really was just a matter of reclaiming authority, because they took a particularly literal interpretation of about 4 or 5 passages in the Bible, rather than taking the metaphorical angle to it.
Right. Okay, thanks, Whitney. I'm just going to interrupt a quick question. I know Roger has a wedding he has to attend, so I think this might be a question for you. Is there recommending book titles? Especially the other question is, can Darwinian evolution be contained in a 7-day week? And then he says, also, we're asking for recommended book titles. I think it might be something we can't do on the fly here. So how are we going to be able to share some of our recommendations? Attend the course. I don't know if we can communicate with people any other way, maybe on Facebook. Add to the Wilmette Institute replay page. Okay. So should we compile a recommended book?
Do I have to limit the list to a certain number of titles?
Yes.
Well, that's why I said this is not going to be an easy list to compile. Yeah.
But
So maybe we can get something.
7 phases, if the days are not literal, 24-hour days, of course they weren't.
No.
But 7 phases of existence or appreciation or understanding, no trouble at all. You notice that humanity doesn't appear until like the 5th. Humanity doesn't appear until, I don't know, the 4th or 5th day.
Yeah.
So just like in our modern cosmology, we're not there until the 9 billionth year. Our world isn't there until the 9 billionth year, and we're not there until the last second.
Yeah.
So.
That's true. Yeah. Okay, Andres. We should be ready to close very shortly.
I believe so, yes. I don't think we have any other questions, just that standing one about evolution in a 7-day week. I'm not sure that even occurs at the microbial level.
Okay.
Evolution is, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Robert showed his face, so that might be a clue for us to wrap up this webinar. So thanks everyone again, especially the panel members. This was fun, informative. We do have a poll to show, maybe not, or maybe I'll let Robert take it over from here.
I don't know. I think Boyd is the one who would run the poll, or
Okay.
the poll.
No, there's no poll. That's fine. We want it to be scientific. Speaking of which, somebody mentioned evaluation is so important
We can
to learn.
We can put a link on the replay page.
Yes, we could do
And more than that, we can send it out, I think, afterwards to everybody who
Okay.
heard. No, that wouldn't get the people who watched it on Facebook or YouTube. So we may want to put it on the webpage for the talk. I just want to thank all of you. First of all, Charlotte, you're a fantastic host.
Oh, good.
Really.
Yes.
With great grace and very articulate. You really did a great job. And I want to thank you for hosting this. And I really want to thank all of the staff and faculty for this particular course, for pulling this together. I know how hard you worked on it and how many hours you spent talking about it and organizing and refining everything. And it really came across, I think, very clearly. I'm sure we'll have many people watching this in the future in the recording. And So again, thank you all. And I want to again thank our audience for tuning in. And we look forward to seeing people in our future webinars. And so on that note, I want to say goodbye to everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks very much,
Thank you
Robert.
so much.
Okay, bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good luck, everyone.
Goodbye.